Magician by Raymond E. Feist, New Revised Edition, book review. So this book, I think, has a cult following. I kind of just picked it up at random. It was lying around in a book exchange. I was living in Japan at the time, and if you've ever lived abroad, you know it's kind of difficult to get English books sometimes. So there would be kind of book exchanges set up where people would just leave a book they were finished with, and you could just pick it up and leave one of your own. And I saw it, and you know, I've always had a soft spot for fantasy. I don't really devour fantasy books the way I know some other bookworms do, but I enjoy a good fantasy every now and again. Now, a funny thing, I was reading this book, and I was working at the time in a small school with only 4 other coworkers. And two out of the 4 said, "Oh, you're reading that book? I really love that book." And then, you know, talk to me about how they really love the whole series and stuff like that. Typical of a lot of fantasy books, this isn't just a book, this is the beginning of a whole series. Although for me it was just a book, because I never went on to the rest of the series. But yeah, anyways, it's really popular with a lot of people, which is why I'm a little bit nervous because I'm going to give this a bad review. But bear with me, this is just one man's opinion. If you thought it was great, let me know in the comments why it was great. Part of the problem, I think, is I got the New Revised Edition. So the book was originally published in 1982. The New Revised Edition, which was the one I read, was published in 1992. And at that point, you know, I guess the book had been successful enough that the publishers wanted to revisit it. And Raymond Feist added 15,000 words of text omitted from previous editions. Yeah, it's a funny thing, these New Revised Editions. I've always been kind of a nerd for details, or kind of a completist. Like, I want the whole story. I want the unabridged version. I want all the details. And yet, whenever I read an author's expanded version, especially kind of in fantasy, I always ended up hating it. So American Gods, I read kind of Neil Gaiman's expanded edition, and which he added back in all the stuff that his publishers made him cut out the first time, and didn't like it. The Stand by Stephen King, same thing. I read his expanded edition in which he added back in all the stuff that the publishers made him cut out the first time. And I thought, oh, this is just so long and meandering and pointless. Yeah, and then here. I'm reading the revised edition in which Raymond Feist has added back in all the stuff his publishers made him cut out the first time. Now granted, I don't have the original edition to compare it with, but I definitely get the feeling that this book could have used an editor, and presumably had a good editor on the first edition. I don't know. It was just really long, and so many different plot lines, and so many things that went nowhere, yeah. Anyways, let's talk about the book. It's an interesting book. Now, it starts out as kind of just a standard fantasy genre. I think Feist is ripping off Tolkien here, but it's difficult to know what to make of that, because I think really every fantasy writer has been ripping off Tolkien for the past, I don't know, 50 years or whatever, 60 years. And I'll go through some of these things, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think all of these go back to Tolkien. The Elves. Now, like, I think in traditional, like, you know, the Grimm's Brothers fairy tales, elves were like these little imps who had magic and did tricks and stuff like that. Tolkien was the one who made elves not into these like little creatures who helped shoemakers, but now they were these kind of forest druid, mystical, godlike creatures. Well, not godlike, but, you know, kind of magical creatures who were tall and handsome and lived in the forest. Feist Feist uses that description of elves, but I think that goes back to Tolkien. The dwarfs as a race of kind of miners who mine underground, I think that comes from Tolkien, right? People are smoking in this book, which is an anachronism, right? Because smoking actually didn't come to Europe until like the exploration of the New World and they found tobacco. Tolkien, for whatever reason, really loves smoking. So he has like, his characters are smoking pipes. I think Tolkien gets around this by saying it's not tobacco, it's some sort of weed or something like that. But nobody in kind of ancient Europe was smoking. So to put that in there as an anachronism, I mean, I know it's fantasy, but it's fantasy based on ancient European mythology. And it's an anachronism that comes directly from Tolkien. You're kind of ripping off Tolkien if your fantasy characters are smoking. And then the elves and the orcs are related races, which I think is from Tolkien as well, in Feist. Now, you've got a lot of characters and plot lines going on in this book. And I guess as part of the appeal of fantasy books is just kind of getting totally immersed in this fantasy world and figure out, okay, who are all these characters? Who are all these different races? Where's everybody on the map? And just when you're getting your head around all this, something rather bizarre happens, which is aliens invade. So it's like a fantasy story mixed with an alien invasion story. Now the difference is there's no spaceships or laser beams. What happens is they do come from a different planet, but they're able to open up some portal with magic. It's magic instead of spaceships. But this invading race comes in from a completely different planet. Now, at first, these invaders are just kind of like an enemy army. But then, one of the main characters gets captured and then taken back to the aliens' home world. And then, all of a sudden, we're in a completely different fantasy world. And we've got to learn all the rules about this world, all the history, the politics, the different fantasy races on this world, and who's plotting against who on this world, and the culture of this planet. Now, to be perfectly fair, Feist acknowledges all of this. And the foreword, and the author's foreword to the revised edition, Feist writes, "I hesitate to admit this publicly, but the truth is that part of the success of this book was my ignorance of what makes a commercially successful novel. My willingness to plunge blindly forward into a tale spanning 2 dissimilar worlds, covering 12 years, in the lives of several major characters and dozens of minor characters, breaking numerous rules of plotting along the way, seemed to find kindred souls among readers the world over." Well, obviously, I guess it did, because this book apparently has a bit of a following. But, yeah, he's kind of put his finger directly on the button. Is that the expression? He's put his finger directly on it about what potentially makes this book such a disaster. 2 different worlds, 12 years, so many major characters and so many minor characters. Of course, I guess it just occurs to me now, in this day and age of Game of Thrones, maybe I shouldn't be complaining about this. And I do consider myself a Game of Thrones fan, although I'm one of those fans who never read the books, just the TV show. But the appeal of that is just how many different characters and plot lines it's juggling. Yeah, to me though, for the Book of the Magician, I found the ending was disappointing. And I was kind of tracking with it up until the whole time. I was expecting everything to pay off, all these different plots to pay off. And they never really paid off. And I think maybe that was part of my problem with the wrong expectation. I think for fans of this book, the point of it is not that this is all building to something. The point of this is just the pleasure of immersing yourself in all these different fantasy worlds. I was expecting a payoff. I was thinking, okay, I'm spending all this intellectual energy keeping track of all these characters and all these different worlds, but there's a reason for it, right? It's going to pay off with a really satisfying ending. And it didn't pay off with a really satisfying ending. For my money. Talking about the writing style here, I thought the descriptive passages of the book were pretty good, but I thought the dialogue was terrible. The dialogue is somewhat of a cross between kind of a formal epic style of kind of high fantasy like Tolkien, and also a more colloquial modern style, which to my ear just came off sounding very terrible. I don't know if this will convey the feeling, but everyone in the book talks like they're in a book instead of like talking like real people talk. Now, I mentioned that 2 of my 4 coworkers were huge fans of this book. One of them told me that even among fans of this book, the dialogue is something that fans will criticize. It's also, the dialogue attribution is also overloaded with adverbs or adverbial phrases. For example, he said sadly, he said softly, he said happily, things like that. This is what's known as Tom Swifties, because the old Tom Swift adventure books used to be loaded with these things. Most people, I think maybe most notably Stephen King, say this is bad writing. You shouldn't be doing that. Although I've also read some people pushing back against that recently and saying like, everybody says you shouldn't do this, but actually it's perfectly fine. I guess at the end of the day, whatever the reader is fine with is perfectly fine, huh? There's no like objective way to measure good writing other than whatever the reader is enjoying. Yeah, but obviously I'm complaining about it because it caught my ear. I thought this is a little bit too much. All these adjectives after said. He said happily, he said sadly, etc. So all in all, it wasn't for me, and I didn't continue with the series after this. But I know this book has a lot of big fans, so let me know why you liked it.